All right, my M272 people, it is time for the M014 composite intake manifold swap guide. So I'm not going to be doing the actual manifold swap in front of you. People who have been subscribed to this channel for a long time, back when I had the black car update, if you missed it, the last video I posted kind of explained why I don't have that car anymore. But anyways, a lot of you guys are coming from those videos when I was posting the retrofit of the M014 composite intake manifold swap onto my M272 E25. A lot of you guys have reached out to me, be it in the comments, on Instagram, which you're always welcome to do if you have any questions, asking about doing the swap, what it's like, what needs to be done with questions after you guys have done the swap. This is basically going to be a guide not on how to do the swap, but of what parts you need, how much it's going to cost, and what must be done in order for the car to run properly, and what you should know going into it, because we are changing a lot of the dynamics of how the car was originally engineered. Even if it is just an intake manifold swap and some other things, the car is going to drive differently. There's no point in beating around the bush with that. That's why we're doing this mod, but we'll get into it a little bit heavier further on in this video, but I want to just basically lay out the groundwork of what you can expect the car to drive like afterwards and what you're going to be getting into when you do this manifold swap. So without further ado, let's get into it. So to begin, let's just start off with why we're going to swap the manifold in the first place. So from the factory, these cars came with a magnesium intake manifold, and it came with these plastic runner flaps throughout both the left and the right side banks that feed into the intake, or into the intake ports where the valves are, on top of the engine. So this is actually a really cool design. It's used in a whole host of vehicles that aren't Mercedes even. The Audi Volkswagen 2.0 Ts, a whole bunch of like random diesel cars, that sort of thing, because it's a really effective way of playing with the power band of a car. So in the case of the Mercedes and a lot of other cars, effectively what happens is these flaps are able to manipulate the airflow to provide a whole bunch more torque down low, open up and add more airflow towards the top to create a really linear power band. It's actually a very effective way of delivering power. A lot of the time it does make sense. On the M272, it also often makes sense. It's how you're going to get your strongest mid-range, so that's you're driving around town, rolling into throttle, maybe on the highway, rolling into the throttle, you get that nice wave of torque. Car's going to drive great. The problem with the M272 though is, as you may have seen on another video that was done earlier on this channel, they have a tendency with these intake manifolds that the flaps will eventually break, typically in one of two ways, which I'll get into in a second. A lot of this is due to the nature of the PCV system of the M272. You have driver's side, there's the PCV, there's a single PCV on top of the cylinder head. And then additionally on the passenger side of the engine, this is all US spec vehicles, passenger side of the engine to the rear, you have the oil drip pan and the oil drip tray. The driver's side PCV is your standard, more traditional PCV, venting your crankcase pressure, separating the oil and the air, and it's going to feed a little bit of that sort of residue, oily air, whatever you want to call it, back through the throttle body. It actually goes right in the top of the throttle body and back into the intake manifold and back through the engine. That one, you should still stay on top of it and replace it when it's due. Typically, it's not as prone to failing as the oil drip pan and drip tray, which is going to be our main focus here. So as I mentioned, these are on the back of the US passenger side cylinder head of the M272, right up against the firewall, really annoying to service. I remember I had a big problem with it when I did it on mine. Effectively what happens is you have a diffuser that mounts to the back of the camshaft, and its job is, as it's spinning, it's separating oil and air just like a normal PCV system. And then you have the drip tray, which is basically a cap that goes over it. It has a gasket that wears over time, both that fits over the camshaft, or not the camshaft, sorry, the drip pan, which is that diffuser, and then also it has a gasket that mounts to the back of the engine. So if you're getting additional oil kind of on the back of that cylinder head, a lot of the time it's going to be the drip tray gasket itself on like the sealing gasket. But what happens a lot of the time is you'll have the drip pan spinning in there, and as things age and metals wear and things tarnish, you get a little bit of play in the shaft that comes off of the drip pan. And as you're getting that little bit of play, that shaft has a nice seal on the back side of the drip tray. So as it's wiggling a little bit, it starts to slowly erode that seal over time that's on the drip tray. And effectively what's going to happen is you're going to start getting a little bit more oil progressively sneaking through the drip tray, which is also venting back into the intake boot, which then feeds down to the throttle body. The intake boot, for clarification purpose, is this weird L-shaped plastic elbow that goes down from your MAF sensor to your throttle body. If you look down in the back of your M272, it's right up against the firewall. It looks like a boot. So pretty easy to identify, but you'll see while you're back there, there's a hose that goes up from that boot over to the passenger side rear of the engine, and you're going to see a black cap on the end of the cylinder head. That's going to be your drip tray, and right inside behind it is your drip pan. So anyways, as the seal erodes, you start getting more oil through. Car is effectively going to start respirating more of its oil. And while it's not like a direct injection motor where you have to worry about valve tarnishing and carbon buildup and stuff like that, because since it is port injection, the fuel is going to clean the back of those valves. What you do have to worry about is all that oil is going into your intake manifold with your adjustable runner flaps, and it's going to start gunking things up. That's what happened on mine. It's what happens on a lot of these M272s, and that's usually the culprit of why these flaps are going to fail. These flaps fail a lot. It's just a common thing with these cars. It's part of the nature of owning this engine. You have to be ready for the flaps to fail at some point. Mine, when I bought the car, I think it had 130,000 miles or something like that, and it was throwing a code when I purchased it for a manifold flap failure. So what typically happens is as things gunk up, whether it's from oil or just old use, whatever it may be, the flaps aren't able to actuate as easily on the inside, and maybe since that's plastic, maybe that breaks in there. Additionally, there's an actuating arm on the front that's plastic. Pretty commonly those will break, and then it can't actuate one side bank or the other. And ultimately what you'll get is check engine light. You might have reduced power. You'll definitely have reduced fuel economy. And yeah, because it can't as accurately control the airflow or control the airflow at all, the car's not going to run as well. So a lot of people, what they'll do, if there's the plastic piece in front of the intake manifold, I'm blanking on what I just called it, but there's an actuating arm. And they do sell metal replacements that are a retrofit. These are obviously resolving the issue of the plastic one breaking, but the problem is these plastic flaps on the inside of the runner, it's not uncommon for as things get older and dry up a little bit, the plastic flaps have actually been documented to drop into the intake valves, which can be catastrophic to the top end of the motor, to the entire engine, whatever it may be. So I generally like to advise that if your car needs an intake manifold, just do a whole intake manifold. If you go to the effort of putting on a metal actuating arm, you're still adding the extra risk that at some point a flap is going to drop and potentially cause major damage. Versus if you put in a new intake manifold, especially a quality one, you're guaranteeing, I mean, my car had 130,000 miles on it when I got it, and it had the check engine light for the flaps, so I don't know how long it was on, but figure you're getting another 100,000 miles of life if you put on a new intake manifold. And if you buy the thing from FCP Euro, it's got a lifetime warranty. So the next time you need it, you get another one for free. I mean, there's different debates you can have about it, but ultimately I would say a lot of the time, just buy the new intake manifold. Okay, so now that we've covered that, in terms of why you would do a manifold on this car, let's talk about the M014 composite manifold specifically. So the reason that one would switch to the M014 manifold, I did it because I needed the intake manifold. As I mentioned, I was throwing a code. Connecticut, after you buy a car, before you can get the car registered, you have to pass through emissions. can't pass through emissions when you have a check engine light. So I had that, and I knew I was going to need to resolve that before I could register the car. Typically, for most people, I would advise to just do your standard magnesium intake manifold because it's going to work perfectly, it's going to retain your drivability, and that's the end of the story. You slap the manifold in, it's all direct bolt up, and it works. However, this M014 manifold swap, the composite one, is one of the only modifications you can do that's a guaranteed power adder in some aspects for the M272. We'll get into that too. But it's one of the only performance mods. So the other options are like headers, and some people say intakes, but the car has a really effective factory intake system. Whatever you're doing to try and make some sort of weird intake retrofit kit is probably not going to work as well. I hate to break it to you, but get a high flow filter for your air filter housing and run it through those snorkel tubes that go up to the front of the car, and it's probably going to be as efficient as you can get the system. That engine breathes very well. Anyways, the M014 manifold swap, one of the only modifications you can do, and what's interesting about it is it doesn't have flaps. So it becomes just a straight through system. You're completely eliminating the actuating flaps, the swirl flaps that we've been talking about this whole time. Now, let's get into the M014 manifold and what it is before we get into why you would want to eliminate those flaps. So the M014 package as a whole, not just this intake manifold, it's an actual package, was available on late model SLK350 Mercedes vehicles on the R171 platform. So these were the SLK cars. They had the 3.5 liter DE35 M272, and they additionally had what was called an M014 Sport package, which added a bunch of really cool things. So one of them is obviously this intake manifold, the M014 composite manifold. Traditionally, the SLK 350 or 300 or 280 would have the magnesium manifold, but this special M014 package got the composite manifold from the factory. It was just for these cars. It's a pretty rare package too. They got a special air intake housing, so where the air filters go, the big engine cover, it had a red stripe down the middle instead of your standard silver. I don't really think there are any breathing benefits to that as far as I know. It just looks cool. And if you ever find them for sale, they're incredibly expensive because they never come up. But more importantly, you have the composite manifold, you have an 82 millimeter throttle body. I believe that's up from 74 millimeters, I believe, stock M272. I don't know off the top of my head right now. It's one of those two. Either way, it's a massively upsized throttle body. You're going to have revised valve springs. It's going to have a totally different factory ECU tune that revs to 7,200 RPM, different camshafts. Basically, it's like a hot version of the M272. If you think back to like a stroker motor or something from the DTM days where you have just totally revised breathing, cams, that's like, think E30 M3 Evo or something like that. It's a breather kit. And these motors made stock, the M272 E35, the 3.5, is making, I believe, typically 260-ish for crank horsepower. Sorry about that. 260-ish for crank horsepower, and the M014 cars are making over 300 horsepower. And they rev like crazy, up to 7,200 RPM versus stock M272 E35 is somewhere around, I don't know, a little over the mid sixes. So these cars rip, and that whole package as a whole rips. The cars are awesome. Anyways, because of the fact that this kit exists, we have some sort of OEM plus mods that we can dip our toes into if you just have a standard M272. I'm not going to go to the effort of installing the valves, springs, and reinforcement so that I can rev the car higher. It would be cool, but it's pretty time consuming and it's expensive. I'm not going to install the cams. I'm not going to do any of the crazy whatever else there's other things in that kit that I just can't think of off the top of my head. But what I can do is slap this manifold on there and source the throttle body and be making some more power because I'm going to be getting better airflow. That being said, it's also reasonably cost effective to buy the M014 intake manifold. So a standard OE magnesium factory replacement from a trusted brand like Pierberg, for example, with all of the like injector seals, literally everything you need to do the swap, ballpark is usually around $680. That's for, again, a quality OE product. Not like, I mean, if you go on eBay, you might find something cheaper. If you go to genuine Mercedes, it's probably gonna be more like $1,000. And that's also not including labor. It's not the easiest job to do. It's pretty labor intensive. I don't doubt with a YouTube guide, anyone could do it. You just gotta be really careful because you're playing with the head of the vehicle. Once you take that intake manifold off, you're looking right at the back of the valves. So there's a lot of things that need to be removed, etc., whatever. Anyways, for that intake manifold in the full kit, it's about $700 figure for a quality part. The M014 manifold with a lifetime warranty from FCP Euro, I have right here as $384. There's a lot more that is to that. We'll get into that also, but at a base level, the intake manifold is very approachable, the composite manifold. Additionally, what it's going to do is by deleting those flaps, what you're going to do is create effectively a path of least resistance that's going to make the car drive a lot more like you would expect a naturally aspirated car to drive. What does that mean? It's a very linear power band and makes all of like the most of its power at the very top of the rev range. So it's going like this. Whereas factory, with those flaps to actuate where the airflow is going, where the torque is being produced, you're going to have sort of a peaky beginning, like tip-in sort of, because as the car is dumping air and compensating and using those flaps to control airflow, and it's going to deliver a big bulk of torque right in the middle, and then up top it's probably going to die off a little bit. So M014 manifold, a ton more power at the top of the rev range. Driving around town, driving on the highway, significantly less power. I didn't realize that was something I was going to have to emphasize. Drivability will be affected. I got an ECU tune. We'll get into that also in a minute. That definitely helped. But the fact of the matter is we're changing where the power lies on the car. And that's not something that's just, you go in there, you change the fuel tables and it's fixed, because we're totally changing the way that the car breathes. So you can anticipate that while the car very likely will make more power with the M014 manifold in these mods, it's going to totally change the way it drives. It's going to feel a lot slower at the bottom portion of the rev range, say 2 to 3 grand when you're wide open, maybe 2 to 4. Through the middle, it's going to start ramping in really hard, and then up by 5,500 or so, and for that last 5 to 800 RPM, whatever motor you may have, the car is going to rip. That's where it's going to like to live, and a little bit before that even. Why do you do this? If you track the car, if you autocross the car, something like that, you're going to be spending most of your time in the top of the rev range. This is the mod for people who are going to be abusing, I'll say that lightly, abusing the car. If you're going to be dailying the car, this isn't necessarily the modification for you. It still totally works. It does some really cool things. It's just not going to make the car quite as drivable as it was when it's stock, and that's modifications in a nutshell a lot of the time. A lot of the time when you're modifying the car, you're getting much better at one thing and you're sacrificing something else. It's just the nature of modifying cars. It's also the nature of the M014 manifold swap. That being said, if I've said all of this and you still think you may want to do the M014 manifold swap, I'm going to get into the nitty-gritty of it, of what parts you need, what the part numbers are, what you will expect to pay, and what the result will be at the end. So I'm going to switch over to screen recording here. We're going to look at my laptop. I'm going to show you some of the parts. We're going to talk a little bit about that, and we'll get into that. All right. So we are now looking at my guide, or not my guide, but some of the part numbers and stuff that you will need for the manifold swap. You're going to see I have some prices listed here. Those are very tentative. We'll get into those. But basically what this aims to do is show you exactly what you should anticipate getting into. Again, this is a pretty labor-intensive job, so if you're going to be having a shop do this for you, if a shop will do this for you, it might be pretty expensive. This total cost number may be nowhere near what you'll pay. A shop may very well not touch this because of the fact that there's a lot of custom things going on here that aren't factory. So the first thing we need to get into is, or we're going to get into, is the M014 intake manifold, because that's the easiest part. It just bolts on and you've done the manifold swap effectively. So we have it right here from FCP Euro. As you can see, it says it fits the SLK350. If you come down here to fitment, it will note M014 intake manifold. So as you can see, $354 apparently is actually cheaper than it used to be when I first made this document. $384. All right, nice. So the manifold is just a direct bolt-on, but the most interesting thing about the manifold is because you're getting rid of your actuating flaps, there are 4 sensors, 2 at the front and 2 at the back of the intake manifold, that give the car readings as to your flap position. So when you get the check engine light that's triggered by a broken flap that says, hey, your flap's not actuating to lean, open, close, whatever, it's those sensors telling the car that that is the case. This doesn't have provisions for those sensors because of the fact that it never had the flaps from the factory. In my case, what I elected to do was, since I was getting the car tuned anyways, I elected to have my ECU tuner omit the flap sensors from basically the ECU's readout. They coded it out, whatever you want to call it. So as a result, I never got a check engine light as a result of these flap sensors. You may. If you don't tune the car, I want to just disclose that right now, the car may throw a check engine light for these flaps. I knew I was going to tune the car to begin with because of the fact that there's a lot of airflow mods that we're about to talk about. Whenever you're getting more air into the engine, you should aim to add more fuel. That's how you keep bad things from happening. That's how you keep lean conditions from happening. So to be safe, before I even went into this, even though this is a relatively tame mod in some aspects, I knew I was going to be getting the car tuned. I had reached out to, in this case, we'll see in a minute, OE Tuning, based out of California. I had reached out to them, said, can you omit these flaps if I do this thing? They said yes, and I was like, okay. And I also asked them at the time, can you do this tune for what is effectively an odd and strange mod? And they do a lot of Mercedes stuff, and they said, yes, we've done that before. So I was like, all right, say less. So we have the M014 manifold here. Now, moving up, you can see right over here, there is the inlet from the throttle body. So from the factory, as part of its M014 breather kit, the SLK350 got an 82 millimeter throttle body upsized from the normal M272. Now, what's interesting about that, as you may note here, is that I can buy this used. And the reason is that was actually a retrofit from the factory from the M273 engine. So your SLK350, your S550, E550 had that 82 millimeter throttle body. Mercedes made the M014 kit so that it could directly accommodate the throttle body off of the bigger motor from the factory. So all you have to do is track down a used throttle body from one of these cars. So this is from a 2012 S550, M273 prefix right here. For $200, this genuine throttle body is going to do the job. I don't know the miles on the car. Maybe it says it somewhere in here. It's up to you how you want to do this. If you source a genuine one and it's new, you should be ready to spend over $1,000. If you want to do that, go for it. I was rocking a used junkyard part on my car and it ran excellent. Never threw a code for weird throttle body conditions until the car was hit and totaled. So you can do that. You can buy maybe a rebuild or a knockoff or something like that off of eBay for even cheaper than the $200 listed here. I can't say what the condition of that will be because I never installed one, but it'll probably look prettier. So anyways, mine came in, I cleaned it up. It had a little oily residue from whatever the car it was on, having a little bit of, I don't know, PCV leak or something, because the M273 is effectively a big M272. So a lot of those drip pan issues and stuff that we discussed earlier, they were the same thing on the M273. So I cleaned mine up. You bolt that directly to the M014 composite manifold. And then coming up from the throttle body, what you're going to have is your air deflector. Oop, Get away. Okay. So as you can see, here's our part number right over here. This is that aforementioned boot that I was talking about. So we have right in the diagram here. You can see here is our throttle body. There's a gasket inside the boot, and then it curves up, and that's going to go up to your mass airflow sensor. So because the throttle body is upsized, we also have to upsize the air intake boot. So you have to source this part. This and the throttle body are mandatory, not optional. So you're going to have to do this to make everything fit. You buy the air deflector boot. It will snugly fit directly on top of your new 82mm throttle body. From there, moving up, we have our mass airflow sensor that sits on top. Just like your standard M272 unit, or I should say, your standard M272 unit will fit the new M273 air deflector boot. So it's the same part from the M273 to the M272. It's just the lower portion of the boot that's wider to fit onto the throttle body. The upper portion is the same diameter. So your mass airflow sensor is going to smack right down on top of that. Don't actually smack it. That's very fragile and very expensive. Pops right down on top, and that'll be that portion of the job done. The actual air filter housing itself, the engine cover, you can use your stock M272 cover and it'll be totally fine. The only thing I would say that's wise, while you're in there, check, there's actually a giant fat O-ring that seals your air filter housing, your big engine cover, to the mass airflow sensor. Check the condition of that while you're in there, because those tend to get weathered pretty quickly. They crack, they tear, stuff like that. A lot of that will cause potentially lean conditions, not uncommon. A lot more common is a really rough idle, pulling away or sitting at a stoplight, and then also reduced power. And people will run around chasing that forever and not realize that either that filter might be, or that O-ring might be cracked or torn, leaking, might not be seated all the way down on the mass airflow sensor. So just give it a good once over. Honestly, I think the O-ring is like $20 or something. You might want to just throw a new seal on there. It's the air intake housing seal, I believe it's called. And just smack that in there because it's never going to hurt you. Additionally, like I did with my, you could buy an air deflector, the boot, from a junkyard if you want to. If you do though, I recommend you also get new seals for that. Again, all you're going to do is look up the part number for the air deflector and then the associated seals for that air deflector. So I might have down here also purchased. Yeah, but none of these are really helpful. Anyways, it's not too hard to find. If you really have questions about it, you can just DM me and I'll help you track it down. So after that hardware, we're done. That's the full M014 swap. It's the intake manifold, the 82mm throttle body, the upsized air deflector boot, both the throttle body and the deflector from the M273 engines, and that's it. You put everything else back together. It's really that simple. However, as mentioned earlier, we're omitting the flaps. We're changing the amount of air that can flow into the engine. And because of that, I wanted to change fueling. It's also worth noting, by the way, the M014 manifold comes with all of its own gaskets. So it's going to have the intake manifold gaskets that are going to like smush flat and seal when you bolt it down. It also has a throttle body seal itself built in. So when you buy that kit from FCP Euro, you have all of your gaskets. The one thing I would recommend though, what I did in my case, you could buy new injectors, and that way when you pull the fuel rail off of your old intake manifold, you can just swap on new injectors, pop it into the new intake manifold. I chose to reuse my injectors. I would recommend you get new injector seals just because it's the safe thing to do and it's easy. Reseal your injectors if you don't put on new ones and slap them onto the new manifold. I did not do that. I just lubricated the heck out of the injector seals and it slid in fine. As far as I know, none of them tore because the car ran fine. I would have torn it down and looked at some point, probably before last race season, but the car got hit, so I never really got the chance to do that. So I would add that to your to-dos, M272 fuel injectors, so that when you're swapping the intake manifold, you're swapping them into the intake manifold, you can just make sure everything's spick and span. But yeah, so I chose to go with OE tuning, as I mentioned. Here is their listings for C-Class tuning. If you don't see your car here, you can absolutely reach out to them. That's what I did. So as you can see, C230, 2.5 liter V6, W203. The tune itself is very cheap. they have some versatility in what they could do. As you can see, there's stages. They have your burble tune, which is the bane of my existence. They have power ratings here. Yeah, so none of this explicitly says that they'll tune for the M014 manifold, but I asked them and they said they could. So I was like, all right. Install modification list. I was just honest with that. I told them I did not want to go for power. I wanted to go for reliability because I told them the car is going to see a lot of track time, which it was supposed to, and I just wanted to be safe. So what we did was we tuned out those flap sensors. We tuned for, I believe it was just stage 1, because at the time I had cold air intake filters in my stock housing. I had obviously the breather mods from the M014 kit, and then I just had a muffler on the car, no headers. So I still had stock cats and everything. The car, they will send you it's $295 as listed currently for their tune. I had to pay a little bit extra for the flap delete. I think it was about $100, plus the My Genius tuner, which is the actual thing you plug in your OBD2 port to transfer the files from your laptop and actually tune the vehicle. It was pretty easy to do. OE tuning was super helpful in terms of I was having some issues with my laptop because it was a really old one. And as I was trying to troubleshoot it, they were on the phone with me at weird hours after work when I was getting home to help me work through it. And ultimately we got it done. The car drove awesome. The thing that I need to just emphasize here, because I think this might have been lost in translation at some point, I kind of touched on it before, but the car is going to drive differently. Because we're changing the way the car breathes, it's going to make that power up top, it's going to make less in the mid-range, and it's going to make less at the bottom. So if that's not something you want in your daily driving, this might not be the modification for you. If it's something you do want, or if you're tracking the car or autocrossing the car, this is the right mod. And it's fairly comprehensive, it's pretty easy to do. It actually increased my fuel economy, which might not be saying a lot because since my flaps were broken when I bought the car, it could have been doing some weird stuff with the oxygen sensor readouts and stuff like that to basically richen the mixture and then induce worse fuel economy. I was getting like 30 miles per gallon average though on the highway to and from work. So not bad at all. And all said and done, the car never threw a code after I finished doing this. It's worth noting that when I did do this, I did everything else that you're kind of supposed to do. So I had already done my breather system to be sure that no extra oil would be going back into the intake manifold, although it matters less now because the M014 manifold doesn't have the flaps, so there's nothing to get gunked up in there besides the insides of my pistons. But I did the breather system. I did fresh plugs. They were standard plugs. They weren't genuine Mercedes, I think they were NGK, but they weren't a step colder or anything like that. I did fresh coil packs from Delphi, I believe, also from FCP Euro. And I put in the K&N air filter drop-ins for the stock housing. And probably something else. I think I had done accessory belt and pulleys and whatever, but standard maintenance basically. And the car ran great. It never threw a code, even though I had tuned out sensors that were now just flopping loose in the engine bay for the intake manifold. And it ran great. I was happy with the way it ran because of the fact that I was autocrossing the car and etc. And the car ripped. I had a great time with it. That power at the top is awesome. It comes on and it ramps in like a freight train. The whole engine sound changes. It sounds like it's kind of ripping itself in half, but it's a really reliable mod and it works really well. So effectively, now that we've kind of talked about what the mod is, what parts are required, and why you would do it, we have to get into kind of the long-term effects of why you would do this and kind of the elephants in the room. So as you saw on my screen share that I was showing you, my total cost was $1,270. The cost of a quality magnesium stock replacement, as I mentioned before, from like Pierberg or something like that, from FCP Euro with a lifetime warranty, is $680 roughly. You can get a much cheaper one if you want to risk quality and potentially causing damage if something fails. That's up to you. It's your prerogative. The reason that you're going to spend that extra about $600 is that A, you're getting the power benefit, and B, more importantly, this is a one-time fix. So those flaps that may gunk up over time, seals may erode, cause issues down the future. When you do the M014 manifold swap, you're completely eliminating the flaps, so it's fixed forever. The end. The fact that the M014 manifold is more reliable than the stock manifold. And that's what it all comes down to, plain and simple. You're actually adding power to the car at the top of the rev range, arguably making it more competitive in a performance environment by moving the power band. And at the same time, as long as you're getting a quality tune, you're making the car more reliable. That's kind of what the epitome of an OEM plus mod is. It's from a trusted source that is Mercedes-Benz. All of the equipment we're using is from Mercedes besides the tune, and it's actually going to resolve an issue that is prominent on this engine. You have to make sure you at least weigh in your mind whether or not you want to take the gamble of not getting an ECU tune. Some people say, particularly E35 owners with the 3.5 liter M272, that they can just throw this manifold on. They don't code for the sensors or anything like that. They're just left flopping in there loosey-goosey, and they don't get a tune, and the car throws no codes and drives awesome. I had an E25, which is the tiny motor that makes no power. I believe if I didn't tune the car, for one thing, I think it definitely would have thrown a code. And additionally, I believe the car's drivability would have been compromised because it has such little power and torque to begin with that you're going to feel the car being like, what the heck is going on, a lot more. So if it's trying to figure out, well, there's no flaps now, should I add fuel, should I remove fuel, that whole thing, all of that time that it's trying to figure that out and playing with that, it's going to be more palpable when the car only makes 200 crank horsepower stock. In light of that power figure, the 200 factory crank horsepower, let's talk numbers. So I actually went to EFI Logics in Connecticut over by me, not to check the power necessarily on this car, but I just wanted to check up on the tune and make sure it was safe because OE Tuning had done it remotely. I booked a few pulls and we went and locked. So I'll throw the dyno graph up for you guys, and you will see that with 138,000 miles, the car made 186 wheel horsepower and 160 wheel torque. Again, with 138,000 miles, 186 wheel horsepower and 160 wheel torque. NA tuning is expensive and every horsepower is precious. Additionally, as cars age and gain miles, and if they aren't maintained, they can lose power over time. So in a car, if you figure 15% driveline loss, on a car that makes 200 crank horsepower, to be making 186 wheel with the driveline loss factored in, that's around, figure 210, 220 crank. That's a pretty good amount of power to be making over stock with just the intake manifold and the throttle body, because again, the only modifications done to the car really were drop-in filters, this swap that I've told you about in detail, and then weld-on muffler. That's it. Stock cats, everything. So I actually was really happy with this number, and I sent the logs to EFI. We had a sniffer in the exhaust pipe just to make sure the AFRs were good because I didn't have an AFR gauge. That was the reason that I went. And they said, yep, it actually looks a little rich. We can lean it up for you if you want to make more power. And I was like, nope. I wanted it reliable, so that was where we kept it. A little extra fat, which isn't always the best, but in this case it was within reason. They actually tweaked the tune in a couple spots where they saw it was either a little too rich or a little too lean, and I got my stage 2 revision back, which I have no doubt in my mind if I dynoed the car again before it got hit, would have made the exact same power. It just might have made a little bit more torque and a little more power in some areas where it would have changed the curve a little bit. But I do want to talk this dyno graph, so I'll pull it back up. You'll notice, rather interestingly, you can see the red line, the horsepower. It ramps in pretty linearly. Again, it would have probably been more peaky if I had the stock manifold flaps to deliver that mid-range and low-range torque and horsepower. But you'll see towards the end where it actually ramps in a lot harder. That's what I've been talking about. That's the top of the rev range power. And it's coming in, if you look at the dyno graph, at about 5,000 RPM. almost on the nose, and it carries until redline, around 6,500. So that's going to be that high-end punchy feel, and you get out of the car. That's why we do this manifold swap. Rather interestingly, though, if you look at the torque, it is almost a flat line all the way through the rev range. And that actually makes a really weird sensation that any of the people who have reached out to me about this have kind of had an issue grasping, I think. Because what that does effectively is you roll into the throttle and it gives you that initial punch of torque, and you're waiting for it to keep building, but it kind of doesn't. You keep gaining speed as the power is building, but there's never really any additional feeling of going harder. And that's because this torque is just level all the way across the rev range. From a performance driving perspective, that's actually an awesome thing to see. It's very controllable. It means you're making a fair amount of torque all the time. However, it feels less dramatic than a car with a less flat torque curve would be. I see this as a positive, but it's again one of those things that if you're in traffic, it's going to make it feel like the car is not accelerating quickly. You probably will be building a fair amount of speed with the way the horsepower is ramping in, but that torque is what makes you feel like you are accelerating again. Kind of the last nuts and bolts of it. I've effectively, by proxy, I think, become the go-to source for this manifold swap on the internet because I'm posting content about it. As a result of that, I've had a lot of you guys reach out via the comments with interest in doing it. I've had a lot of you guys reach out on Instagram, either because you were interested or had done it and you wanted to talk about it. I always encourage that. I just want to kind of give you this guide so you can know exactly what you're getting into. Common reports that I've heard with this manifold swap, because it's not all that hard to do. If you planned on DIYing the stock manifold swap, you could probably DIY the M014 manifold swap. It's mostly the same nuts and bolts. You just have to know how to track down the parts. Again, it becomes a toss-up. It's cheaper to put in the stock manifold. I just want to acknowledge that straight up. You do get the additional reliability and the one-time replacement out of the M014 swap, but you're going to be paying an extra $600 or so if you tune the car. When people do reach out to me after doing this swap and they're not over the moon with it, it's generally because of the fact that they hadn't either come to the equation ready for themselves to lose that low and mid-range power, or more commonly, the car is untuned. It's still yet to be proven, to me anyways, because I never drove my car without a tune. I knew I wanted to tune out the gate. I knew I was going to be adding a lot more air. I wanted to avoid a lean condition because lean conditions are where bad things happen internally on the motor. So I tuned the car before I even started it for the first time with the manifold. But I've had people reach out. They say the car is absolutely a dog in accelerating. They have to drop 2 gears to accelerate. And usually when I ask, is the car tuned? The answer is no. Does it make all the difference in the world? Probably not. Mercedes is pretty adaptive with their ECUs, with their oxygen sensors, with their NOx sensors in terms of changing fuel tables to compensate for whatever the environment is. Can it make a difference though? Absolutely. If you're telling the car to deliver the right amount of fuel in the right spots and kind of changing that mindset that it once was programmed for with the flaps actuating, that can make a huge difference. Again, on the E25 cars with the tiny little motor, it's very possible that you'd feel this a lot more than if you had a 3.5. So a 3.5 or a 3 liter might be able to skate by without a tune if you're okay with it throwing a flap sensor code, or if it chooses not to for whatever reason. Probably will though. Tuning is generally just a smart move. I mean, if you look at that manifold swap guide I put together, going back to the chart that I had, a lot of the bill that is accumulated in there is down to the tune. I'd say that's about 50% of the full bill. If you take the tune out of the equation, it's going to be a close race between just a stock manifold replacement or the M014 retrofit, but I really do recommend the tune. As for my car, it didn't miss a beat. It never threw code the whole time that I owned it with this swap, and I owned this car. Basically, I put the manifold on the car before the car was registered. So the whole time I was driving this car, it had the M014 retrofit for the most part. It ran great. I liked the power that it made. I I had the manual, so I didn't mind dropping a couple extra gears, ripping gears, whatever that I needed to do to keep up with traffic, even though the car was slow. It was, yeah, I mean, I enjoyed it. You really need to consider, though, if the cost is worth it to you and if the change in drivability is worth it to you. And that's what you need to come into this whole DIY and this swap with, because it's very possible for the extra $600 you'd be spending over a quality stock manifold, you could go and get a set of headers that might add the same amount of power but not change the power band. Or maybe you go and get a full set of brakes for the car, pads and rotors, performance set. The car is going to perform a lot better, and it's also going to stop you faster, which is a lot more useful than more power a lot of the time, but it might be the same price as just upgrading to the M014 manifold. So it will ultimately be up to you to decide if this is the worthwhile mod for you. If you're okay with the changed power band, if you're okay with getting in there, getting dirty, because I don't think any shop is going to want to do this retrofit for you. You got to track down the parts yourself. You're going to have to do some of it yourself. If you can do that, this is a pretty cool mod for someone who's going to drive the car hard in a performance environment. If you're just commuting with the car, it's going to feel more usable and faster with the stock magnesium manifold. That's just the way it is. And that's kind of all that there is. I unfortunately will not be expanding on this very much because of the fact that I no longer own the car. So, I mean, I still know about the swap and I'm still learning about the swap. You can feel free to DM me and I'll forward you any information that I know. Additionally, as a result of this awesome community, I have a lot of people that reach out to me that did have issues with the swap, found really unique, clever workarounds that have managed. There were things that I never thought about that have managed to make their cars drive substantially better. I have one friend now, a Mercedes tech who's in Australia, who did this swap on his E350, wasn't entirely happy with the way the power was working. As far as I know, he did not tune the car, but what he did do is go into Star, which if you have Star, this is gonna apply to you, and he was able to rig up a system with the flap sensors. He was like a physical little system. He showed me a picture of this thing he cobbled together. It was pretty cool. And then also in Star, he was able to code the car to think that the M272 was a M014 SLK350 engine. So it was thinking correctly of how it was supposed to function. But yeah, I mean, there's lots of different angles that you can take with this. And if you reach out to me and I don't have the answer, I might know someone who does, and I'm not going to take credit for their information. I'll send you to the right person, hopefully. I'll, by the way, have the Australian dude's Instagram in here somewhere, because that was pretty impressive what he managed to work out with that manifold, and his car is sick. So unfortunately, not going to see much more M272 content out of me other than maybe refreshers like this for anyone who might need it. But if you like this video, give it the old thumbs up. If you have any questions, drop them down in the comments below. If you're considering this mod, why don't you drop a comment and tell me what country you're from, because I've been pretty surprised to see where this has reached. I've had people in Russia, I've had people in Germany and Australia. It's really cool coming here from the United States as something that started in the flooded garage of my dad's house. So kind of unique, and it's a good mod, but it's one you should weigh heavily. So as always, you can reach out to me on Instagram, same as this page, Danny_playswithcars, one word. And I'll see you in the next one, whatever that may be. I signed up for Grid Life Sunday Cup Time Attack today for my Honda Fit in July. That'll be at New Jersey Motorsports Park, so if you'll be out there, I'll see you. We might see some videos of that car getting ready before the season starts, just because I have some fun things I want to do with it. So I'll check in, but until then, take care.